Hello and welcome to today's online event, Unlocking Europe's Solar and Wind Potential. My name is Dave Keating. I'm a journalist based in Brussels, and I'm coming at you live from the heart of the EU quarter at the Euractiv studios. Now, I imagine everybody watching would agree that, at least as a general principle, Europe needs more renewable energy. However, decisions about where to put those renewable installations have been caught up in controversy for years. It's a debate that has often pitted the fight against climate change against nature and wildlife conservation, often unnecessarily. We've also seen the phenomenon of NIMBYism, or not in my backyard, where people are, in theory, of their country having more renewable installations, but just not somewhere where they can see them. So this makes it imperative that national governments and local authorities conduct research into where the best places to site renewable installations are, in a way that causes minimum disruption to local communities and wildlife. Now, the revised EU Renewable Energy Directive has tasked member states to conduct national renewable energy spatial mapping within a year. So by February 2026, national governments must designate renewable acceleration areas. Now that's a really tight timeline, but it's also important that authorities do this thoughtfully and carefully. The environmental organization, the Nature Conservancy, has come out with a new study identifying low-conflict areas for wind and solar development, and that study has concluded that Europe has enough low-conflict land to achieve 45% of renewables by 2030. But the study also finds that this won't happen on its own, and that it will require conscious adoption of smart siting practices. So today we're going to discuss this report and its implications for national governments as they implement the EU's new renewable energy rules. We'll hear from our panel of experts, and at the end of the discussion, you watching will have the opportunity to ask questions using the Slido feature on your screen. You can go ahead and start putting in your questions now. I'll see those coming in as the event goes on, and then I'll put your questions to the panelists at the end of the online event. Now, to get us started, let's start with a presentation of the study that I was just talking about. I'd like to turn over the floor to Joe Kissaker, lead scientist for the Nature Conservancy's Conservation Lands team, and Cassandra Zorica-Drapulcic, Southeast Europe Renewable Energy Project Manager with the Nature Conservancy Europe.
Great. Dave, I don't know if, yeah, there we go. See the slides, fantastic. Thanks everyone for their time. Really appreciate the opportunity to get a chance to share this study with you all. I think, Dave, you succinctly summarized the results from the study very nicely. Just a little bit of framing from our perspective at the Nature Conservancy. Climate change is clearly the defining challenge of our generation and likely the next several generations. And it will have wide-ranging ecological, environmental, and social impacts, both as it plays out, but also as we try to address the root cause, and that's emissions and energy in particular. Right now, fossil fuels make up roughly 70% of our CO2 emissions. And so in order to address climate change, we're going to have a dramatic move away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. And it's the land use challenges associated with that renewable energy development that is the focus of our work. We've taken 100 years or more to build an energy system based on fossil fuels, and now we have just a couple decades to move away from that. So again, really, really big challenge. If we get the first slide. That renewable energy development is going to take a lot of space, and the where and how we build that out is going to be a key part of addressing the transition. The reality is that renewable energy, in particular wind and solar, which will make up the majority of new installed renewable energy development, take more land. They take more land than fossil fuels, and so that is going to potentially create land use conflicts. Those can be around environmental or social impacts. And it's that conflict that can slow the progress towards the transition. And that has been the focus of our smart siting work for over a decade now. You can get the next slide. One of the take homes and really positives from work that we've done at a variety of different scales, and that's at global scales, which is this summary here is from a paper we published a number of years ago looking globally primarily at environmental impacts in low conflict lands, or whether we look regionally or nationally or at a landscape scale. There tends to be orders of magnitude more low conflict land that's viable, economically viable for wind and solar development than we need for any of the projections or targets that have been established. So that's a positive. We get the next slide. But as we look at how development has been put on the ground, we're seeing that it is targeting areas that will be higher conflict. So this is actually from the study that we published that we're launching today, that looks at solar installations and wind installations and associates those with different land use cover types. And what we're seeing is the majority of both solar and wind are targeting high conflict land cover types. So, for example, solar, a lot of that is hitting agricultural land, given that solar is a complete replacement of land use change from what it was to solar now. Agriculture it's a conflict. Wind, on the other hand, integrates nicely into agricultural landscapes, but we're also seeing a high amount of wind installations in natural systems, forests, as well as grassland systems. So again, the past patterns are suggesting that conflict, if it continues, the business as usual continues, that we can expect more conflict going forward. So that was one of the reasons why we did the study. If we go to the next slide. The study design is relatively simple. I'm not going to go into a lot of details here. The paper's published. It's been out for a couple months now, so you can dig into the details. But we started with the wind and solar resource map to look at the places where wind and solar are viable. We created a conflict index, which uses both land cover types in Natura 2000 sites and protected areas. And then we use those pieces to look at a series of scenarios. We took pathways that were from a report that Ember published, and thankfully we have Chris on the line if we want to dive into some of those details. So we followed a series of 3 pathways, and then we looked at 2 scenarios. A business as usual, which essentially is selecting the development sites primarily by the energy potential and production capacity of those lands. And then a low conflict development scenario where we push development onto these lower conflict land cover types. We let those stated the policies play out under those different scenarios. We put those footprints on the ground, and then we looked at those patterns, the patterns of land use change that might be driven. We can go to the next slide. So just to start really quick, like I said, in other studies, we found similar kinds of patterns. There is a lot of low conflict land as defined by our study, again, which is using primary land cover. And whether we're looking at the 2030 targets for solar or wind, the 2035 targets, or even the 2050 targets, the options and opportunities for low conflict siting are high. Obviously, that field gets narrowed a fair bit when we increase the targets and goals. But again, at the end of the day, there appears to be an abundance of low conflict land, at least to start. Obviously, I think as we get down to local, as we'll talk about in a little bit, some of that might narrow the field a little bit more. You can go to the next slide. But when we look at the business as usual and where development may play out on the ground, we're seeing a lot of high conflict land. So in this slide, purple is high conflict land cover types. So for solar, largely a lot of that is agricultural land. And so you're seeing, as the business as usual would play out, we would expect to see for those future targets, again, a lot of potential overlap with high high conflict land cover types. We can go to the next one. The same for wind, although a little bit less conflict in some countries, but still a preponderance of overlap with high conflict land cover types. Just to go to the next slide, really just give you a sense. You can start to break out. There's a huge amount of data in the study. I'm obviously not going into a lot of detail, but we can look at what some of those high conflict land cover types are. And so for wind, a lot of that is our forested areas, grasslands, and other natural systems. So not something that we necessarily want to see, given the abundance of low conflict land cover types. We go to the next slide. So the assessment that we've done is at a continental scale. We recognize that even the definition of high and low conflict will need to be refined, obviously at local scales, and that's why we've been pushing for a framework that will help us identify those low conflict sites. So we start, and this is an approach that we've been applying in the U.S. and India, and in a second pass it over to Cassandra to talk about some of the examples in Europe. But we tend to start with the energy side of the equation. So what are the biophysical and land use constraints that limit energy development? What are the factors that influence that? In many cases, it's access to transmission or the load centers in which energy is going to be used. So we create a map of renewable energy potential as a starting point. We then move through and look at things like the legal exclusions. So protected areas are an obvious one, and they're often at a jurisdictional scale, whether it's at a national or even at a local scale, things that are identified that might restrict development. One that comes to mind is areas that are important for ecosystem services, such as flood prevention. We don't want to reduce those features and those ecosystem services that are delivered. And like I said, sometimes those vary jurisdictionally. The next are environmental conservation values. And so as a Nature Conservancy, and this is our bread and butter, we really think about how we'll map and put those on the ground. We tend to look at a coarse filter, fine filter, coarse filter being ecological systems, making sure we have representation and good condition of those ecological systems. And then we're also looking at the fine filter, which are species, making sure that what species, in particular migratory species, how they might be impacted or need to be conserved, and making sure those components are in place. Next are the social conservation values, and these are, I think, the biggest hurdle that are going to exist and potentially slow the transition down. So these are, Dave mentioned NIMBYs. These are the things that we want to make sure, as much as we can, we're bringing into the process to identifying those low conflict lands. So there are desktop data sets that we can use, things on religious sites, areas of significance and important for local communities, areas important for tourism, that can all be brought into the mix. Once we have all that data, we can start to ask the question, where are some of those lower conflict, not no conflict, but lower conflict land cover types? How might those areas meet the targets based on the energy potential, and targets at a national or smaller jurisdictional level? And that gives us some options to start to look at scenarios and start to engage with some communities where those higher conflict intersections may occur. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Cassandra, and she's going to talk about some of the local applications.
Just a second. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Hi. Next slide, please. So here is an example of local area where the same methodology has been used. This is a Zadar County in Croatia, which is an example where the same methodology has been used on a local level, on a county level. It's only one county where Croatia could meet more than half of its 2030 renewable energy target without significant impacts on wildlife. This achievement has not only caught the attention of national leaders, but has also been recognized by the European Commission as a model approach for the guidance on renewable acceleration area. Zadar County, with over 2,000 hours of sunshine annually and one of Europe's windiest climates, holds immense potential for renewables. However, more than 50% of the county falls within EU Natura 2000 network, home to species like the brown bear and golden eagle. This makes Zadar a prime example of how smart siting, by combining renewable energy potential with biodiversity protection, can shape the future of sustainable energy development. Next slide, please. TNC is already rolling out smart siting methodology across the Western Balkans by using 3C approach, integrating conservation, climate, and communities. We had 2 piloting projects in Zadar and in Nikšić County in Montenegro that led to the development of national studies. In Serbia, we identified 100 solar development sites with the capacity of 10 megawatt each, estimated to power 200,000 Serbian households and save 1 million tons in carbon emissions annually. In North Macedonia, priorities for renewable energy rollout were brownfields, degraded and converted lands. That research identified twice land needed to meet the country electricity demand. Currently, we are conducting 2 national siting studies for the entire Croatia and Montenegro with the support of relevant ministries and partnering with local institutes and experts. By overlaying environmental and social data with solar and wind potential, we are ensuring that renewable energy projects are developed in low conflict areas and in that way avoiding harm to nature and local communities. We are working in partnership with the Energy Community Secretariat and supporting 9 contracting parties, including all Western Balkan countries, to accelerate their renewable energy transition. Here, our efforts are particularly crucial as fossil fuels still dominate electricity production in these regions. But with the right tools and guidance, we can scale up solar and wind energy in ways that safeguard ecosystem and enhance communities. And for a conclusion, by mainstreaming this smart siting and particularly important engaging stakeholders early in the process while using data-driven approaches, we can meet renewable energy targets across the Balkans and beyond. In that way, contributing to Europe's ambitious climate goals while protecting our natural and cultural heritage. Back to you, Joe. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's it. You can go to the next slide. Just a couple of links to share. A book that was published a number of years ago that kind of frames up some of the issue and in particular some of the smart siting approaches with examples from all over the world. The study itself in the lower right-hand corner, if you haven't already seen it, you can check it out. I also draw your attention to a report that outlines examples associated with our smart siting approach. And then in the upper right-hand corner, the example that Cassandra went through in Zadar County that goes through the details. So check these out. And of course, obviously, you can reach out to us if you have more questions that we don't get to address during the call today, or if you want to see more examples. So thank you so much again for your time, and back to you, Dave.
Great. Thanks so much, Joe and Cassandra, for walking us through the study. So we're now going to move on to the panel discussion where we'll talk about the study and what should be done with it. What should be the actionable things that policymakers can learn and move forward on. Let me introduce you to our panelists now. We have here with us today Alif Gunduzieli, Renewable Energy Program Lead at the Nature Conservancy Europe, Chris Roslow, Senior Energy and Climate Data Analyst at Ember, Cosimo Tansini, Senior Policy Officer for Renewable Energy at the European Environmental Bureau, Andreas Uhlheim, Project Leader at the Energy and Industry Geography Lab at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, Siddharth Sarin, Professor at the Center for Climate and Energy Transformation at the University of Bergen, and the incoming research professor at the Fridtjof Nansen Institute in Oslo. And finally, Ariel Brunner, Regional Director for BirdLife Europe and Central Asia. Welcome to all of the panelists. Thanks so much for joining us today. A reminder, you at home can ask your questions to the panelists using the Slido QR code that you see on your screen there. You can put those questions in, and I'll put your questions to the panelists toward the end of our discussion. So I first want to go around the table here and get some quick reactions to what we've just heard in the study. Elif, let me start with you. In terms of what should be taken here as policy lessons, especially as these areas are being designated, what do you think are the main points that people should understand from this?
Yes, thanks, Dave. Good afternoon, everyone. So, as you mentioned at the very beginning, the clock is ticking. So, there is EU-level legislation mandating member states to do their national spatial planning by May 2025, and then the renewable acceleration areas by February 2026. So, this is quite tight timeline, as you mentioned. The clock is ticking, but all of this is happening to actually accelerate renewables, right? To tackle climate change so that EU can hit its 2030 targets, but also for energy independence. Like, there is a whole energy security debate that hasn't been over yet, and the whole ambition is higher up since then. So one shouldn't forget that doing this exercise, yes, it looks like it's a tight timeline, but there needs to be what we call these smart siting approaches to make sure that afterwards the renewables can actually accelerate, so that they're not they're not harming people and nature, and B, they're not blocked by very obvious conflicts that we could identify at a very broader geographic level. In terms of what are the main takeaways, or then what should guide the governments and national authorities and local governments and local authorities, is that, well, the study shows, as Joe also explained quite clearly, that there is enough lower conflict land to deploy solar and wind for Europe to achieve 2030 targets. That we know. Of course, it changes, as also it was mentioned. We did it at a broader scale. As we go at a granular geographic level, things get more complex. The example of Zadar, for example, what Cassandra mentioned, this is where we get the heart of the debate around social concerns and more granular biodiversity data, etc. But overall, at a broader scale, we know that there is lower conflict land that exists. But this is not going to happen through magic wand, right? Like, the renewables will not go on to the right places, as we also show that the business as usual development is likely to go to higher conflict areas. So what needs to happen, also based on our experience with different actors, with different partners at national and even local and regional level, is first of all stakeholder engagement. We can't repeat that enough, because putting mapping layers, yes, it's very technical. Yes, it's not the easiest thing in the world, but with enough technical knowledge, this can be done in a fairly short amount of time. However, doing it in a way that people give their consensus and they can actually help, meaning different stakeholders at national level, communities and local actors can actually give you the more granular data, the more granular concerns to move this in the right direction. So that is why what we call is for the member states, for European countries, to adopt a smart siting approach. So it is an approach, and proper stakeholder engagement should be a part of it, from national stakeholders to local communities and local stakeholders. Secondly, do a phased approach. There are 2 dates, and there are different ways of doing it. There is the May 2025 date for national spatial mapping, so basically for the countries to show where it's technically feasible to put solar and wind. And then there's a second date, it's 2026 February, renewable acceleration areas. Well, if the countries stab at directly renewable acceleration areas, then it's skipping a lot of steps between point zero and the end result. So it should be, as it is in the legislation, that's why there are 2 dates and one comes way before the other, is that renewable acceleration areas should be a part of the national spatial planning exercise. And the national spatial planning exercise should not be claimed as if these are the areas where renewables will not have any obstacles, and these are going to be the areas that will help achieve NECPs without putting any layers. So we all know that renewables will not only go to renewable acceleration areas, of course, different places. However, between that and just technically looking at the areas where the sun shines, the wind blows, and where there is transmission lines, it is also a bit misleading for also developers as much as the people, because it will not consider any of the biodiversity and social concerns, so that they can come up as obstacles. And finally, it is the cross-sector energy system and land use planning. So this is not directly at the heart of what we're speaking, but it's very much linked. What we see at national and local levels is that when the countries do not have an overarching plan for their energy infrastructure, and other speakers can speak more about that as well, and land use planning across different sectors, then the debate becomes really difficult with different stakeholders as well. Everyone wants to obviously push their own interest on the land use without any accurate planning and policies at a longer term. Yeah, that's it from my side for the moment.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's an important distinction to make with the two deadlines and to make sure that those aren't completely separate from one another, right? So Chris, I'm interested to get your perspective here as an energy think tank. What were your main takeaways when hearing about the study?
Thanks a lot, Dave. Yeah, just to remind people, the study used wind and solar projections from EMBA on Europe's needs in the future. And I think the good news really is that our studies together, so the power system modeling on our side and this spatial analysis on the side of TNC, really show that Europe can power itself with renewables. And broadly speaking, Europe does possess the space and the wind and solar resources to do so. So I think there is an optimistic message broadly coming from this. Of course, there'll be challenges, as has been discussed. And kind of further to that, why I'm even more encouraged by this is that the scenarios that we provided to the Nature Conservancy for this study were actually very ambitious scenarios in terms of their deployment of wind and solar on land in particular. So again, it's just kind of reinforces that message that even with very ambitious scenarios based on very high levels of electrification, we still get the answer that although it's not all low conflict land, there is sufficient land available for these renewable resources. For me, actually, one of the issues that the study highlights quite well, though, is how the availability of this so-called low conflict land varies quite a lot between countries. So you have countries like Germany, which are finding actually could become quite spatially constrained in the 2030s, given their ambitious wind and solar targets. On the other hand, you have countries like Spain and Romania, which, at least in theory, have vast quantities of low conflict land, good renewable conditions, where renewable energy could be really economically attractive and possible to develop. And the implication of that is one, quite simply, some countries have an easier task with this spatial mapping than others, it seems. But I think there's a second, more interesting implication, which is that however we roll out this infrastructure, we'll have some parts of Europe producing energy for other parts of Europe. We'll have rural communities producing energy for cities. We'll have some countries producing energy to be exported to other countries if the system all works in the most efficient way. I think that raises really interesting questions around the sense of solidarity that we need across regions in order to make this all work. And broadly speaking, it means that in order to kind of liberate Europe's power system from fossil fuels, which of course is the aim we're all driving for, we'll need more interdependence within Europe in order to ensure greater independence from kind of outside of Europe and international fossil fuel markets. So I think that's a good observation that this study kind of brings to the forefront.
Great. So Cosimo, let's turn to you next. What are your main takeaways from the study we've just heard?
Thanks, Dave. It's really good to be joining today, and thanks to the authors. It's really good that this mapping exercises are being conducted. We think that they can constitute a very useful blueprint for different level of authorities that now are called to implement the Renewable Energy Directive. So I represent the EEB. We are a network of environmental organizations, primarily from Europe. We really like our mission is multifaceted. We think about the current planetary crisis as a set of triple crises. So we have the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and the pollution crisis. But we really think that the RED is the right instruments to unlock the renewable potential of Europe, give us a chance to stay on track with climate pathways. And we think that if it's implemented well, it can also help addressing the other two crises. I think it's already been touched upon. The transposition deadlines must be strictly respected now by member states. As you rightfully mentioned, Dave, they're not to be seen as separate, but as complementary phases of the same process. The RED more in general must be implemented in its entirety, at the same time allowing for the necessary flexibility and to tailor the designation of renewable areas to the specific environmental and social needs of the areas. So, as also mentioned by Elif, it's very important that we bring the public engagement element really into the picture. This is responsibility of all the levels of governance, but I think should become more and more standard practice for project developers, utilities, and including environmental NGOs, civil society organization, to become really active in these processes, starting with the mapping exercise, where as Elif mentioned, the inclusion of also local scientific expertise and lots of local stakeholders can bring about massive benefits. We look with huge interest at the estimates on low conflict land, and especially on the lower conflict land. We think that it is very important now that this, especially where you have member states with more flexibility meeting their targets on lower conflict land, that the strategic spatial planning approach achieves precisely this, to prioritize those low-hanging fruits. And of course, we appreciate that different member states have different situations. We also got to the conclusion based on data from the PAC scenario, which is also an ambitious and strongly wind and solar growth-led scenario. We came to similar conclusions. We saw Germany as one of the states where there's limited flexibility. And so again, back to the implementation of the RED, I think it calls for a differentiated approach, so that the countries with land surplus may be focusing more in this with lower conflict land surplus, may be focusing more in this phase to adopting a timeline to prioritize really the lowest conflict sites, while opening up gradually after 2030 as this potential is used up. And by contrast, countries with limited flexibility should focus first and foremost on adopting, I think, robust, credible sets of mitigation measures. Those are going to be very important. For this, I think the role of regions and municipalities should not be overlooked. And just to conclude, maybe also another point that we think is very important is that siting decisions, and in the grander scheme of things, spatial planning, processes may be well facilitated when it comes to renewable energies if the right schemes to make sure that the benefits of this clean energy generation reaches the most vulnerable in our societies. So we know how Europe struggles with energy poverty. We know that there are going to be categories more affected by this transition and by the kicking in of the emission trading scheme for domestic households and transport. But I'll stop here just to say energy poverty schemes that make the renewables benefits reach the most in need are going to be also very pivotal. Thank you.
Thanks, Cosimo. So, Andreas, let's turn to you next. Obviously, the JRC has also been looking into these issues. What was your reaction to the TNC study?
Yeah, I think welcome first from my side also to everyone. It's a very interesting study that shows also a lot of points that we've seen in the literature and that also our research tells us. I think it was mentioned also a couple of times. First, it's a data-driven process. So we will need a lot of data first. We've seen also in the study the usual approach of looking into resource availability, looking into the land cover and land use data, looking also in data that tells us a bit where we can technically build renewables, like what does the terrain look like, what slopes do we have, and so on. It's also crucial, I think that's also in the study, that you have data on infrastructure. So where you need to be in a proximity to the transmission and distribution grids. You need to also take into account grid expansion plans and reinforcements of the grids. And of course, big topic of today is taking into account the environmental impacts. And in order to minimize the negative effects on ecosystems and wildlife, you need a lot of data. I think basically digital tools are crucial also for this. We are offering one here at the JRC, the Energy and Industry Geography Lab, but of course member states have also their own digital tools, and you need a wealth of data. But I also see that there is an issue with data availability and also data reliability and the robustness of data. So what that brings me a bit to the second point. I think in all these studies and all these process, you should more thinking into scenarios because you have some uncertainties and it's best to show the probable bandwidth or different approaches that lead to different outcomes, to visualize them. Also with maps, I think that's a very powerful approach to engage with the stakeholders and to discuss the different policy options you have. And we have already a lot of best practice examples. The Portuguese have developed a very nice approach. The study that we've seen has also used scenarios to show also the variety that you can have in the results. I think what's also maybe crucial is in the whole process, and that goes now a bit beyond the study, when it comes to RES siting, I think it's important to have a clear identification of the roles and responsibilities in the process. Which authorities are in charge? Will you have a rather centralized or decentralized approach? This depends always on the national circumstances. I think every approach has their pros and cons. Also here, we have seen many best practices where you can learn from. Whether you choose a bottom-up approach or a top-down approach should also depend a bit on the capacity of the relevant levels to perform this process. But it's, I think, really important that you have a clear organization of the role and responsibilities in the whole process. Well, what is clear is that also the stakeholder engagement, the public consultation is an important part in that. And also here, the local and regional level should be empowered. They're closer to the communities, and I think they should play an important role. What also has been mentioned here is that it's very much an interlinked and an international issue. We are doing this planning at the member state level. We are designating these areas on a member state level, but all the energy system is interconnected and linked. We have power lines, we have a European-wide electricity system, we have a gas system, and I think we can optimize the whole system both for reaching our climate targets, but also when we look at it from an environmental point of view, to have a better and more optimal result when we look at it from an European perspective. For example, of course, the potential is not the same everywhere. The wind blows not everywhere. The sunshine does not everywhere the same way, and also maybe not at the same time. I think this is also an issue we have to tackle, is the not only the spatial resolution, but also the resolution in time. So we're looking at the load, at the hourly profiles. When do we actually need electricity or energy? And I would just like to close with a last point, which is adds another complexity, I think, to the debate. We are often using the data of the present and the past, but I think we should also take into account what what do we face in the future? We might have change in land use and land cover. We have population dynamics. We have critical infrastructure that we might want to build or move. We have also, of course, when we look at climate change, future impacts on the energy system. The patterns of wind and solar might change. We have also, of course, range shift of protected or species of wildlife that might adapt. So that's something we need to really consider. Also, we might also envisage the expansion of protected areas in the future. So I think that's also something we need to do and look also a bit in the long term, because we're going to build the infrastructure for the next decades. And I think it's really wise to take that into account already now. Thanks.
Thanks. Siddharth, let's turn to you next to get an academic perspective on this. What's your main reaction to the TNC study?
I think it's a very timely one, so my congratulations to the authors there. I think it's, from an academic perspective, also really nice to see the kind of different disciplinary competencies that you need to bring together to do a study of that sort. And then I think it's worth putting that in perspective and saying, what is it going to be useful for, right? So there's the clear application that we should be able to figure out how to reach the quite ambitious, quite urgent target while minimizing damage and trade-offs, so to speak. But I think within that, and as the previous speaker pointed out just towards the close, we also need to consider the perspective of the local residents and various interest groups. There's no one view on the ground. And also that this is the beginning of a very important and very large adventure. So we don't want to get to 45% and then think that the rest is going to sort of solve itself. Then we're going to basically get into incremental difficulties if we've taken up the easiest areas, so to speak. So towards that, I have a couple of thoughts. In working with renewable energy development in various contexts, one of the things I found is key is that there has to be some element of local benefit that's systematic and that's not steered just by the developers or by the prevalent interest in building a particular project, and not just from a national level either, because there are quite complex configurations of interests in any locality in the general area, and they're quite unequally poised and positioned to be able to articulate themselves, to be able to be recognized within the particular processes of planning, of giving approvals and go ahead to a particular project in a given way. That means that we need to have some approaches that could be a national fund, but that's controlled locally, that has scope for participatory engagement in defining and actually approving what sort of local developments accompany the siting decisions for particular kinds of plants. There are different concerns here of land, of ecology, of traditional cultural practices and uses of land, including usufruct rights that are not very easily visible or mappable, that are deeply embedded in particular sociocultural landscapes. And even though these are really sophisticated techniques being tried and coming at it from many directions in studies of this sort, there's also something that TNC is doing and several others are doing in different ways. Here in Norway, you see it playing out with some of the wind energy debates, and I think it makes it really interesting to engage with, is this really going to work? Because what we see here is that you end up with complications based on the modalities of the rollout. So you might think that there's going to be low conflict at these sites, but you still need to approach it step by step, make sure that the engagement and involvement is respectful, is fit for purpose, given the particular traditions that exist in a context, given the peoples and the particular values embedded in landscapes. So that's one bit of it that I think is a really difficult nut to crack, and that smart siting as an approach gives us a really good basis for it. Gives us, I would say, an optimized use of the databases available to be able to take up some of those more intractable questions. And then I think that it's important to bear in mind that a lot of the work is still to be done. This is a good point of departure. What we then get into is what are the kind of competencies that exist in those contexts? Are small municipalities, are marginalized regions able to actually draw on the kind of local resources, and here I also mean human resources, to be able to have those processes steered and to ensure that they play out in ways that are truly inclusive, that can secure equity in a meaningful way, for which this gives us a good starting point, but which still requires some sort of nuanced implementation. And then returning to Andrea's point about, what happens a few years down the line as we hopefully hit the targets of the Renewable Energy Directive and are then moving into probably more ambitious territory, because we don't see the kind of progress that we'd like pretty much anywhere in terms of building out renewables with the necessary speed. Then do we just say, well, okay, we identified the sort of acceptable level of conflict for the first bit, and now we can't help it. This beast has got to grow, and it'll eat up, ways of living and ways of doing things and ways of valuing landscapes, because we need to go from 45 to 55 to 75. So yes, securing protected areas, being 2 steps ahead with those kinds of regulatory safeguards and standards is one part of it. But another is to really work within landscapes to see how can renewables be integrated and ensconced and become part of what people live with. And there, I think that developing those models of local development, of how people live with solar, how people live with landscapes, that's hard work. And that's work that some of that contextualization, that situated rollout will help us to learn from. So I think that there's a role for the smart siting approach beyond what's been done, and that's really important and timely work. But I think thinking sort of past February 2026, the key evolution of this kind of approach that I'd like to see would be, when you actually implement, can you find ways of delivering value jointly with the communities and the capacities that exist in these very different geographies? And that's endless work, but that is necessary work, because 2030 is not so far away either. And it will not be it won't be possible to do it in a quick and dirty way. There'll be a lot of need for learning and transferring insights across contexts and situating them in those different communities.
Thanks. Let's go to Ariel from BirdLife next. Ariel, I mentioned at the beginning that one of the conflicts here has been particularly between wind power and wildlife. So I'm curious to get your reactions to the studies, particularly in its conclusions on low-risk areas, and also maybe some responses to what we've heard so far from the other panelists.
Sure. So first of all, I have to commend TNC for the study, which is incredibly timely, and it adds a very useful tool for the planning that urgently needs to happen. There are we've had tools from the JRC. Our own network has been doing sensitivity studies in several countries. We really, really desperately need governments to take those things seriously. And you talked a little bit about the timeline for the next couple of years. We really need governments to, in the coming months, clarify the process they will use, and then use next year to do the mapping and the proper, transparent, inclusive consultations, so that they can get in the following year areas, and really give sort of security of planning to the companies. Unfortunately, we see across Europe either authorities basically shirking away from the responsibility and not doing their homework, and then leaving it to the developers to kind of do trial and error, which then leads you to a lot of conflict and unneeded damage, and actually slows down the process. Or on the other side, we are seeing decision makers falling for the temptation to kind of skip the necessary steps and just go straight into designating areas, slapping them on the map and saying those areas are going to be okay. And again, that's just going to store them trouble for the future. So I think there is really no excuse for governments now for not doing their homeworks, and we need to work together across NGOs, companies, everybody else to kind of force their hand to do what needs to be done. Just maybe two specific things, because I've looked into the studies for the moment, not with the needed depth. So maybe two questions for the authors. I mean, one is just a clarification about when you've looked at the potential. Have you looked only at the land potential? So how have you treated offshore wind? Is that incorporated into your scenarios, or might there actually be even more potential out there when you start going offshore? The other issue is that you have taken as high sensitivity agricultural areas, which is true up to a point, but there is actually a huge potential for combining agriculture and solar in fairly benign ways. It depends on how you design it, but there are a lot of developments in what is called agrovoltaics, where you can have pasture beneath the panels, or combination of cropping and panels, which in many cases can even improve agricultural productivity in terms of shading crops and so on. And also we have a lot of highly intensive agricultural areas where actually solar farms can be designed to be beneficial to biodiversity and even help in terms of bringing back pollinators and so on. So that's an area where I would be a bit interested in your thinking. But broadly speaking, I think we've heard the right things from the other speakers. So the importance of sound science and data, inclusive consultation. It's not enough to just look at the data and centrally decide. You need to engage civil society, local communities, thinking about the issues of benefit sharing and how can you give something back both to nature and to local communities. On that, I would really flag up the opportunity of aligning the planning of renewables with the planning of the implementation of the Nature Restoration Law, which has just come into force. This really gives us the opportunity to move from a logic of kind of competition for land into a joint-up planning, where we put our renewable targets and our nature recovery targets and see how we can pursue them together. And sometimes they can be combined and sometimes they need to be segregated. But it's a lot more powerful when we look at them together. The other thought is that, as we've seen, the right things will not happen by themselves. So part of it is about the sound planning, but some of it is also by maxing out on the really good stuff. So, for example, one source of frustration that then plays into the kind of opposition and NIMBYism is the fact that so little is being done in much of Europe on things like rooftop solar or deploying solar over parking lots and shopping center and so on. There are things that are at the lowest end of the risk or the problematic end of the spectrum. We really need to massively put our efforts and money behind them. Similar things like agrovoltaic, is not something that is going to happen on itself, because it's more difficult, more expensive. So we need not just policies that move the projects from the worst locations to the better locations, but also targeted policies to really drive the best options in a preferential way. And maybe finally, the really big importance of ensuring the follow-up, monitoring, transparency, data sharing, because a lot of cynicism is being bred by the fact that developers make promises about mitigation, about things like that, and then nobody knows whether those things are actually happening or not. and the negative kind of anti-renewable lobby always kind of is there whispering in people's ears. So we should make sure that whatever we build, we monitor it, we put it transparently in the public domain so that we can learn from the mistakes and not make them again, or prove the naysayers wrong, which in both cases is in the interest of a long-term fast renewable deployment. Because, and on that I would finish, this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. Yes, we need to ramp it up very fast, but trying to go super fast and then getting stuck and collapsing is not good. We need to accelerate over decades. So doing right is doing fast, and doing fast is going far. Thanks.
Thanks, Ariel. That's a good point about possible synergies with the nature restoration law. In terms of your two questions to Joe, I'm going to hold them for just a second because we've had similar questions from the audience. So I'm going to I'll put those to Joe in just a moment when I go to the audience Q&A. But I wanted to zoom out first. And Cosimo, I have a question for you, which is a real policy question. So we're talking now about the deadlines that are going to be coming up with the revision of EU renewable energy rules. What is your take in terms of where we are right now? How optimistic are you feeling that the Renewable Energy Directive revision will improve the situation for siting renewable installations? And what are your expectations for once it's fully transposed? Right now, where we are at September 2024, are you feeling positive or negative about it?
Of course, it's always a mixed bag. I'm very optimistic by nature. What we're seeing is that there's interesting progress. So what I expect on the not so optimistic side, I expect that there will be front runners and laggards. So we'll have some learning to do. Many governments will have some learning to do. Like on the more optimistic side, I'm convinced that where implementation will be done like in the right way, and as Ariel was saying, it's a marathon and not a sprint. That will constitute the final blueprint of the way forward. As I said before, like implementation must be really comprehensive. It must go hand in hand with the objectives of the nature restoration law, because that's also sort of another landscape challenge that we'll need to have. I think that things that we'll have to look at sure are the standards for the agri-PV. Those are the for the agrivoltaic where this is feasible. Progress on the grid development. Also for how the future grid will impact these assessments on low conflicts, on feasible areas for renewable deployment. I think, contrary to the experience of the RED II, the entirety of articles and provisions on renewable energy communities, these were a bit overlooked with RED II. If it's the case that member states heed those and put in place those provisions, I guess that's also one of the most strategic elements of the RED. Yeah, that makes me feel positive. Thank you.
That's optimistic. Elif, in the same vein, when we're looking at how the RED is tasking the member states to deal with this, it's obviously going to be up to national authorities kind of how to delegate the authority, right, to the local authorities when they're implementing smart siting at a country level. So from your perspective, where is it best for those decisions to be taken? Does that really vary by country, given that we have very different situations in terms of local government in different EU member states? And from a stakeholder perspective, how do you think stakeholders should be engaging in this process going forward ahead of these two deadlines in terms of engaging both with the national authorities and with the local authorities on creating these plans?
Yes, thank you so much for these. The first one is not that easy to answer, but the short answer is that it depends. It's very place-based, context-based, and country. Not even country, even like local, more granular than that. Every country has their own way of doing this. We have some member states who have delegated the leadership to local governments, whereas others are keeping it central at national level. So there is no one way of doing it, and there is no golden rule of decision making in there. But in terms of stakeholder engagement, so yeah, that also links with who has this decision making power. But regardless, what we see is like these all member states are supposed to do this citing smart or not so smart in a given timeline, right? And they're technicians doing it. So what is the task given to the technicians? Go and map out, like put mapping layers and then come back with a map. Is that the task? Or is the task like go and find available areas that are likely to host low conflict, or then like places where people and nature are more respected, or maybe are less likely to come up as a constraint to renewable energy acceleration. So this is about the task itself and how it's given to who at national or local level. Because what we see is that what we observe in different places is that the task is usually limited to mapping, go out and put the layers on top of each other. And there the problem is, of course, like it's not easy, by the way. What we're suggesting, do a proper stakeholder engagement, put a stakeholder engagement process that is adequate, that has people's input, buy-in, knowledge from the beginning. It is very hard. It is hard to bring different interest groups around the same table. It is hard to bring people with different expertise and knowledge around the same table and show them maps, for example. But if you don't do it at the start, then what happens, as we witness in different places, is that technicians, scientists work on a map and then they show the end product to get feedback, just like environmental impact assessment processes, right? And like, here's our map, what do you think? And then people go completely against it because they haven't been part of it since the beginning. So they question it, like, why is this credible? Where does this come from? Why don't we know about it while we were doing all of that? Because we're showing maps to people and people live or work around these areas. So obviously when they see an end product to reflect on, even if the map is done really nicely, adequately, people, just because they weren't engaged from the beginning properly, they're like, their first reaction is like, wait, stop there, because this is where I live or this is where I work, and we need to talk about it, right? So the shorter answer to your second question is when to do it from the start. And this is the hard bit, do it from the start, meaning as the process starts, whoever is running the siting process, mapping process, should be tasked to do a preliminary stakeholder engagement at different levels so that people at least know that this is happening and at least know how the technicians are looking at it, because they may and they probably have something to say about it. They may have different studies that were done. As Ariel was also mentioning, there are different NGOs, there are different think tanks. There's a lot of resource with the JRC, for example, and member states have their own laboratories and energy institutes doing it. So there's a lot of knowledge in there. Whoever is tasked to run this process needs to gather all of that and then assess and reassess what is going to happen, and then go deeper down to local level, to communities and the interested stakeholders.
Thanks. So let's go to some questions that have come in from the audience next. So Joe, I'm going to put some questions from the audience to you. It's actually also related to the question that Ariel just asked you, which is whether or not agricultural areas are automatically high sensitivity, given that they have big potential for combining agriculture and solar. So here are the two questions that have come in from the audience. Do you see agrovoltaics as a chance for local government to access less energy, reducing risk on electrification, and also keeping local STK belonging to the communities? And then second question, what do you think about agrivoltaics, the dual use of the land in parallel, energy and agricultural production at the same time? Those are meant to at least significantly reduce the competition for land for different uses. Could it be a solution to avoid or reduce land use conflicts? So Joe, I'll let you take those.
Sure. Thanks, Greg. Really important questions, and we provide some commentary on it in the paper. I guess within the confines of the study, we did consider agricultural lands as high conflict for solar development, and that's largely because the way development's happening right now is developers want to come in, pack panels as tight as possible, and grow electrons, not electrons and strawberries, right? They're really focused on the energy production side. And so given that sort of pattern in the way development is moving forward, that was the sort of focus of this continental scale assessment. That said, see tremendous potential for agrivoltaics. I think if we could bring it to scale, it would be a way to completely remove conflict between solar development and any conflict, land cover type conflicts that we've identified in the study, if we were able to integrate the two. That said, it's going to require a shift, a sea change from the industry to be willing to develop projects that allow for that sort of compromise. And I think Ariel said it really well, was that the cost for developing those projects is likely to be higher. And so there's going to be some give and take. I think it's also a tremendous opportunity to engage local communities, in particular agricultural communities. I was just in Croatia a couple weeks back, and in conversations with some folks in local communities, one of their big concerns is the change in the sort of fabric of the landscape that is a largely an agricultural community to one that might end up being more industrial scale with respect to renewable energy development. These, the sort of lower intensity developments of PV on agricultural lands, I think, is a way to maintain that quality and what people refer to as the fabric of the landscape, while allowing for renewable energy development to move forward. There's a lot of research right now that's ongoing that looks at the ability to integrate PV with agricultural systems. The results are super positive. I mean, I think in some cases there's increased yield for certain types of crops. There are ways to integrate beyond agriculture, there are ways to integrate solar development that might improve restoration potential for certain ecological systems. So there's a lot of potential, but it's going to require, again, that willingness for the industry to come to the table and make some of the compromises that are going to be necessary.
Andreas, I want to put this question to you as well. Has the JRC done research specifically on this agri-solar combination?
We are also looking into it, indeed. We have not yet published a study, but it's certainly a very interesting approach. I think the colleagues have already mentioned the various advantages. Yes, it comes with a higher cost. You have to balance that. I think one point I would also like to mention, I've seen also some questions in the chat related to that. So I think we should also focus a little bit on the sites that are already now perfectly available for deployment of renewables. We have a lot of artificial and built surfaces, rooftops, the facades of buildings. We have all the transport infrastructure. I see and more solar installations next to roads. For example, we have made a dedicated study on PV potential next to transport infrastructure. I think that's a very valuable part of it. So I think that's also what we're going to do, to look specifically into the potential for agri-PV. Also, I think what we should mention is waste site, industrial site, urban wastewater treatment sites, artificial water bodies. I think there is also a lot of potential that we can still explore. And I think what's not mentioned here, if we're looking into offshore, there's also floating PV for by the way. But I think when we look at the maritime spatial planning, that's also an approach we can probably use, and also use some of the best practice examples for this planning, because there are maritime spatial plans developed with all the stakeholders. They are out and approved, and they also include renewables development, but also many other players, fisheries, transport, shipping, all kinds of uses, environmental areas. So I think that's also a very nice example. But to come back to your questions, yes, agri-PV, I think it will be an important cornerstone also.
Yeah, Joe, I'll put that question to you because yes, as Andreas mentioned, there was a question from the chat. How do you view these where solar can go? How did it work in the modeling when you're factoring solar on buildings, solar along highways, that type of thing? And then I'll also let you address the other thing Andreas was just talking about, which was also a question to you from Ariel. How did you account for offshore wind?
Okay, a couple of these I might also ask Chris to weigh in, because the Ember study that we use as a jumping off point has specific targets for onshore wind and offshore wind, as well as ground-based solar and rooftop solar. So we left those offshore and rooftop alone and focused on the targets for ground-mounted solar and for onshore wind. I think there is just off, just to discuss, I think there's huge potential for offshore wind, and in some cases to alleviate some of the conflicts with land use and land use change. That said, it's not without its impacts. There are particular bird migratory corridors offshore that will be key, and the marine space is while people don't build houses there and have, it's a crowded space as well. So, they would need to be a similar type process that would be undertaken to try to find the balance between where renewables could go offshore and the current uses, as well as impacts potentially to biodiversity, which I will say we know a lot less about offshore than we do onshore.
Chris, did you want to come in on this offshore issue as well, on Ember's work?
Sure. The data we provided for the study indeed splits onshore and offshore wind apart, but the modeling we did actually is based on an economic optimization, which essentially means that the cheapest forms of renewables get priority in the results. But as Ariel was saying before, the cheapest is not always the best. So there are forms of renewables that may cost slightly more to develop, but have greater synergies, result in lower land use conflicts, like agri-PV, offshore wind. And there's definitely trade-offs that are available with those technologies. So we have some scenarios on this. I think the takeaway is that the land use requirements exposed by the TNC study could definitely be lower by increasing offshore wind and other types of solar.
We're just about out of time, but Joe, I did want to put one more question from the audience for you, which is not about wind or solar, but about geothermal, which doesn't have surface issues necessarily like solar and wind might, but siting is a major hurdle. So the question is, how can your model be applied to and highlight the benefits of geothermal?
Yeah, well, first, huge potential for geothermal, and it does have a land footprint not dissimilar to wind development. There's a centralized structure where the geothermal power is tapped, and then you have roads and the same sort of transmission capacity that would need to service and feed out some of the power generation, and so. I guess really quickly, I would say the low conflict land cover maps could be applied to a model that looks at where geothermal potential is. And, like the study that we did continental scale, it's a series of hierarchical filters. This is first cut is something simple like land use cover. The intention for this was to highlight countries where those may bump up against the ceiling of lower conflict land, and then within those countries there's going to be an assessment that needs to be done, and even within those countries at a finer scale, in order to get that public participation and input, there's going to need to be additional data. I love the quote that this is, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, and I very much believe that is the case. the renewable energy go-to areas may have a deadline associated with them, but I think there's still going to need more time to be able to develop and refine those processes at the local scale in order to really move the transition forward. So would agree that there's potential for geothermal, but I see the footprint not dissimilar to wind and or solar in some ways.
Well, we're just about out of time, so I want to thank the panelists for some really interesting insights here. I think both the study and the conversation we've just had have given policymakers a lot to think about, particularly these national policymakers, which are now going to be in charge of making the revised Renewable Energy Directive happen on the ground. As we mentioned, this is going to involve authorities at many different levels who are going to be working on some tight deadlines. So they are going to need a lot of feedback. And I think what we've heard also today is that for stakeholders, for community organizers, for people who have a stake in all of this, it's important to get involved early so you don't have situations where you suddenly have a map and you say, wait, there's my house on the map and I don't know anything about this. So I think some really interesting points that everyone has made. I want to thank all the panelists for some excellent insights. And I'd like to thank you at home for spending your afternoon here with us virtually. And I hope you learned a lot from this discussion. We'll see you right here for the next debate. Take care.